Case intro. Tonight, we uncover the chilling story of Margaret Langley, the wealthy widow who controlled every detail of young immigrant Alejandro Cruz's life, until it ended in a storm of deadly revenge. This is not just a crime, it's a battle for freedom that shocked an entire town. Support my channel by staying active, drop a like, and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Now let's dive in. In a quiet and polished neighborhood, everyone knew the name Margaret Langley. Her towering Victorian home, with its ivy-covered walls and gleaming windows, was the pride of the street. To those who passed by, she was the picture of wealth and refinement, a widow who had built a comfortable life after the passing of her wealthy husband. She was known for her charm, her donations to local charities, and her habit of helping those who had less. When she hired Alejandro Cruz, a 24-year-old immigrant from Honduras, people in town praised her generosity once again. He arrived with little more than a worn backpack and a desire to earn enough to support his family back home. To outsiders, it seemed like fate had smiled on him. Margaret paid him more than the usual rate and offered him a small but cozy guest house on the back of her property. Alejandro felt as though he had finally found stability. The work was simple: cutting grass, cleaning rooms, polishing silverware, and doing errands around town. There were quiet mornings where he drank coffee on the porch before starting work, feeling almost at peace. At first, Alejandro admired Margaret. She seemed elegant and kind, with an air of wisdom he had rarely encountered. But as days turned into weeks, he began to notice how often her eyes followed him, how she asked questions that felt too personal, how she seemed to study him rather than simply talk. What had begun as a job began to feel like something else entirely, something harder to name, an arrangement that would soon pull him deeper than he ever imagined. Margaret's attention toward Alejandro slowly grew more intense. She no longer treated him as just a hired hand. She treated him like a personal project. Soon, his daily routine was filled with tasks that had nothing to do with maintenance. She would summon him inside to sit at her dining table and share meals, teaching him how to use the correct silverware and asking about every detail of his past. She listened closely, almost too closely, whenever he talked about his family in Honduras or the struggles he faced coming to America. At first, Alejandro was flattered. No one had ever taken this much interest in his story. But the kindness came with invisible strings. She began asking him to spend evenings in the main house instead of staying in the guest house, insisting they watch old movies together or drink wine by the fire. If he declined, she would pout or remind him how generous she had been in hiring him and giving him a place to live. Soon she was commenting on what he wore, offering him expensive shirts and shoes that felt too formal for a gardener. Whenever he tried to make plans outside the property, she wanted to know exactly where he was going and when he would return. Alejandro started to feel as though his freedom was shrinking. The job that once gave him security now felt like a life he could not step away from without upsetting her. And each time she praised him or scolded him, it felt like she was shaping him into someone she wanted rather than someone he chose to be. Alejandro's life took a turn when he began dating a young woman he met at the local market. For the first time since moving into Margaret's property, he felt a spark of joy and independence. But when Margaret discovered the relationship, her warmth toward him cooled almost overnight. She stopped inviting him to dinner and began leaving curt, handwritten lists of chores instead of speaking to him directly. The lists were longer, filled with unreasonable tasks that kept him working from sunrise until well after dark. When he finished one list, another would appear the next morning with even more demanding jobs. Margaret began pointing out tiny flaws in his work, a streak on a window, a blade of grass out of place, as if searching for reasons to punish him. She cut his hours, but still expected him to remain on the property in case she needed him. The guest house, once a place of rest, became a space where he collapsed in exhaustion rather than relaxed. Neighbors noticed Alejandro's tired, hollow look, but they assumed he was simply working hard. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed oddly invigorated, as though she thrived on the tension she created. When Alejandro mentioned wanting to find another job, she reminded him of the free rent, the clothes she had bought him, and the help she had given. Each reminder felt less like kindness and more like a chain. The job had begun as a blessing, but now he felt like a prisoner under constant surveillance, his sense of control slipping further away with each passing week. One late evening, while cleaning the study, Alejandro noticed the edge of a drawer slightly open in Margaret's antique desk. Curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully pulled it out. Inside were neat stacks of letters and notes written in Margaret's elegant handwriting. At first, they looked like simple journal entries, but as he read further, he felt a chill spread through him. The letters spoke about him by name, describing him as if he were not just an employee, but something she owned. Words like mine, belonging, and never allowed to leave were repeated over and over. Some notes even described punishing him if he ever betrayed her or tried to walk away. Alejandro sat frozen, realizing this was not just a job gone sour. Margaret was obsessed with him. He quickly put the letters back, but could not shake the feeling of being watched. That night, when Margaret walked past the guest house and glanced toward his window, he felt exposed, as if she knew he had seen her secrets. From then on, his anxiety grew. He started locking the guest house door at night and keeping a kitchen knife near the bed, something he had never done before. Every creak of the old house made him jump. What had once been a peaceful property now felt hostile, as though every shadow might hide a trap. Alejandro could feel Margaret's presence everywhere, even when she wasn't around. The walls that had once given him shelter now seemed to close in, and he began to wonder if he would ever get out before something terrible happened. After the night he found the letters, something inside Alejandro shifted. He no longer felt like an employee, he felt like prey. Margaret's control became sharper, more deliberate, as if she sensed his growing unease. She began docking his pay without explanation, claiming that the cost of his room and meals left him in her debt. Each week, he worked longer hours but had less money to send home. When he asked about it, she reminded him in a cool, measured tone that he had nowhere else to go and no one else willing to give him shelter. Then came the rumors. Margaret told neighbors that Alejandro had a temper, that she had caught him stealing, that she feared what he might do. Soon, when he walked to the local market, people avoided eye contact. Job offers from other houses disappeared. It was as though she had quietly cut every escape route. Alejandro felt himself unraveling. To keep some grip on reality, he began writing in a journal each night, documenting everything she did, every insult, every threat, every controlling act. He even hid a cheap voice recorder in the guest house, capturing her voice when she left him cruel messages. It was the only evidence he had that he wasn't imagining things. But no matter how carefully he documented the abuse, his life kept shrinking. The property that once gave him safety now felt like a trap with no exit. Anger replaced fear, and the anger grew louder with each passing day, until he no longer wondered if he would leave, only how far he might go to break free. The rain had been falling all evening, tapping against the windows of the guest house like a steady drumbeat. Alejandro sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the latest note Margaret had left. The words were short and chilling. "You can never leave me." It was the final push he didn't know he had been waiting for. Fear gave way to something colder, a calm, focused rage. He felt as though he had been buried alive for months, and now there was only one way to dig himself out. He waited until the house went quiet. The old grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, and Alejandro stepped into the rain, letting it soak through his shirt as he crossed the yard. The side door was never locked. She never needed to. She believed she had full control over him. He moved silently through the halls, each creak of the floorboards making his heart pound harder. Margaret was asleep in her grand bedroom, her figure faintly visible in the glow of the bedside lamp she always left on. For a moment, Alejandro froze, torn between leaving and ending it all. Then, months of humiliation, control, and fear came rushing back in a single wave. What happened next was fast and violent. The confrontation spilled into chaos, leaving Margaret lifeless on the floor. Alejandro stood motionless, his breath ragged, the room heavy with silence except for the rain outside. There was no satisfaction, no relief, only the horrifying realization that his life, whatever it had been before this night, was now gone forever. For a long moment, Alejandro stood frozen in Margaret's room, the sound of the rain muffled by the thick walls. His hands were trembling, his shirt clinging to him with sweat and rainwater. Then survival instincts took over. He could not let it end like this, with the truth laid bare. Moving quickly, he searched the house for anything that might point to him. He found the letters he had discovered weeks earlier, and shoved them into his pocket. He wiped down door handles, gathered anything he had touched that day, and tried to erase his presence. But the house itself seemed to work against him. The creak of the stairs, the echo of his own footsteps, the portraits staring down from the hallway. It all felt as though the house was accusing him. Still, he forced himself to keep moving. He smashed a small window near the back door to make it look like a burglar had forced entry. He pulled jewelry from Margaret's box and scattered it across the floor, leaving one or two pieces missing to suggest a theft. By the time he was finished, hours had passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. He returned to the guest house only long enough to grab his bag and the small amount of cash he had hidden. Without looking back, he slipped into the early morning mist and left the property behind. The house was silent, but to Alejandro, it felt as if it were still watching him as he disappeared into the waking world, carrying both his freedom and his crime. For 2 days, no one noticed anything unusual about Margaret's house. The neighbors assumed she was away on one of her quiet weekend trips. But when the mail began to pile up and the lights stayed on through the night, someone finally called the police for a welfare check. Officers arrived to find the smashed window and scattered jewelry, just as Alejandro had left them. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong, but detectives quickly noticed things that didn't add up. The drawers weren't fully emptied, and nothing expensive had actually been taken except for a few small items. It looked staged. The search of the property led them to the guest house, where they found Alejandro's journal hidden under the bed. The detailed entries painted a disturbing picture of psychological control, dates, descriptions of threats, even mentions of neighbors who had heard Margaret's harsh words. What could have helped his case now turned into a roadmap showing his growing anger and obsession with escape. The town buzzed with gossip as police circulated his photo and called him a person of interest. To some, Alejandro became a villain who had taken advantage of a generous woman and murdered her. To others, he was a young man pushed to the edge by someone who wanted to own him. Detectives followed every lead, tracking sightings of him across bus stations and cheap motels. Each day the search grew closer, as if the walls that had once trapped him were now moving with him, closing in no matter how far he ran. Alejandro was finally caught a week later in a small town 2 states away, exhausted and living off what little cash he had left. When police surrounded him, he didn't run. He simply raised his hands and surrendered, almost relieved that the chase was over. During questioning, he confessed calmly, explaining everything that had happened on Margaret's estate, the letters, the manipulation, the threats, the rumors that had left him jobless and trapped. Detectives listened but remained skeptical. A confession was still a confession, and the prosecution moved quickly to charge him with murder. At trial, Alejandro's defense attorneys presented his journal, the recordings, and even testimony from neighbors who had seen Margaret's increasingly controlling behavior. The jury was faced with a complicated truth. Alejandro had undeniably killed her, but the story leading to that night was darker and more complex than a simple crime of greed or anger. Some jurors were visibly shaken hearing the letters read aloud, the possessive language Margaret had used about him. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of manslaughter rather than murder. Alejandro was sentenced to years in prison, not life, a decision that left the courtroom divided. Some believed justice had been served, others called it an outrage. From his cell, Alejandro became something of a symbol. To some, of a man who broke free from control too late. To others, of the cost of letting someone's power over you go unchallenged for too long. The house where it all happened was eventually sold, but locals say it still feels unnervingly quiet, as if the walls themselves remember what took place inside.